It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Okay.
Hello everyone and welcome to 10 Times the Terror. This is Paul Leggett and I'm the host today, and we're very happy to have with us Dr. Andrew Walsh. Andy, I can call you Andy, I guess, right?
That's fine, yes.
Yeah, and Andy's the author of a fascinating book, Faith Across the Mutliverse, and his really dealing with the relationship of religious faith to science. And that's been a long-standing debate going back at least to the time of the Reformation. But I'd like to just plunge right in here, Andy, and just ask you, how do you see religious faith relating to science?
Yeah, so where I was most interested, I felt like people had a sense, or there's a sense that science can be difficult to interact with religion because it's taking things away from religion, things that used to be the domain of religion or questions that religion had the answers to. Now science was providing answers to. So I felt like the opposite was true, that science really enriched my understanding of my Christian faith, and so I wanted to provide some of that for other people, to give that sense of there is something valuable in science that we can add to our understanding of our Christian faith, rather than feeling like it's taking something away. And in particular, that something is language, ideas, concepts that we can use to enrich our conversations about topics that come up in religious conversations.
Yeah, your book is fascinating on this. Could you give us some examples of how you see that science could enrich if you will, the vocabulary and thought categories of faith?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favorites from the book is this idea that we can think about grace in terms of the mathematics of chaos theory. Now, for those who aren't familiar with chaos theory, you might have come across some of the concepts in the film or the book Jurassic Park, or the phrase the butterfly effect. This idea that there are some kinds of systems where small changes in some input or some initial step create big changes in the outcome. So the butterfly effect comes from this idea, and it's not actually we don't know for sure this is how weather works, but it's the illustration that a butterfly could flap its wings in China or Japan, and that's why we had snow today here in Pittsburgh instead of sunshine today, because it's just those little tiny impacts on the weather patterns in that part of the world, on that side of the world, days, weeks later, rippled and accumulated and magnified until they had a big effect here. That's one aspect of the mathematics of chaos theory. There are some systems that show this effect, and that's kind of contrary to our everyday experience, where if you are tossing a ball, you throw it a little bit harder, it goes a little bit farther. You throw it a little bit softer, it doesn't go quite as far, right? That the small change has a small effect. And so observing these systems where a small change has a really big effect was a surprising feature of these mathematical systems. But another surprising feature of these mathematical systems is that even with that small changes that can have big effects feature, they can also have these stable patterns, where even if the system doesn't come back to exactly the same point, there is some what they call attractor or some orbit or some pattern that persists, and you can poke the system and you can perturb it, you can make these changes, and it'll come back to that stable pattern. There's a famous one called the Lorentz attractor. Kind of looks like a figure 8. It's one system of equations that if you run it through, it always tends back towards this kind of figure 8 shape. And there are other kinds of examples. It's believed that our heartbeats, for example, are governed by a system that has this kind of property. There's a bunch of different cells in our hearts that all have to contract to create a heartbeat, and they all have to do it together. And there's some robustness to that if some of them get a little bit faster or a little bit slower, they can actually get back in sync, as opposed to kind of spiraling into some sort of chaotic or uncoordinated pattern. And so that helps keep our heart going, because it can be robust or resilient to these little perturbations. And so to me, that feature of chaotic systems, that ability to come back to some stable pattern, kind of has a feeling something like the idea of grace, God's grace, that even if we make small changes in how we do things in our lives, that God's overall pattern will not be disrupted, that we can come back into good standing with him. And so that just, that helps me take something that feels abstract, right? This idea of grace, something we talk about a lot, but what does that look like? And I can connect it to something that I can understand concretely, these mathematical equations, these graphs, these charts, these videos you can watch of these different systems evolving. And it makes a little bit more sense to me. And so I thought maybe it might help to make a little bit more sense to other people as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. My area to ask you about is theology and Greek philosophy and then mythology. I teach mythology courses at the local college here, and there's a couple of examples. I'd just like to get your take on them that do show up even in Reformation theology of Luther and Calvin, especially Calvin. But a critical one that occurs in Homer's The Iliad is that in the middle of a battle, Zeus, who is the Lord of heaven and earth, and supposedly the most powerful being in the Greek universe, has a son fighting in the Trojan War, and the son, whose name is Sarpedon, is fated to die in this particular battle, and Zeus doesn't want him to die. Zeus starts talking about, well, if I'm the king of the gods, can't I just intervene and change fate and secure Sarpedon's life? And his wife Hera says, well, you could do that, but in effect, you would create chaos. That's a very famous illustration. What do you think? And how does that relate a little bit to what you're talking about? All right, so Zeus says, yeah. Hera acknowledges, yes, you're the Lord, king of the world. You could do this, but if you did do it, it would provoke negative reactions from the other gods, and it would in effect create chaos.
Yes, that's an interesting question. That's one area where perhaps the name of chaos theory is a little bit challenging to work with. And I even stumbled over that myself because I was describing something as chaotic as sort of contrary to the mathematics that I was describing, right? Because we have this sort of more informal understanding, or perhaps even a formal but more classical understanding, that there's order and there's chaos, and these two things are sort of the opposites of each other, and that if you make some disruption to an ordered system, it's going to become disordered, it's going to become chaotic, it's just going to be out of control. And the mathematics that we call chaos theory kind of describes something that is in between those two things, where there's definitely order to it, right? There are simple equations that describe how these systems behave. They have stable patterns of behavior, stable patterns of activity, like the Lorenz attractor I was describing, or like the rhythmic heartbeats that I was talking about. And so there's some structure and order and stability to it. At the same time, there is an underlying, not exactly randomness, but unpredictability to the small scale features of the system within underlying that overall pattern, right? In that Lorenz attractor, I can't predict where the system is going to be in that figure 8 2, 3, 4 steps from now, right? Because any small change that I make is going to have a big change in where it winds up in that figure 8. But I know, broadly speaking, it's going to be in part of that figure 8 or somewhere very close to it. If you were looking at the individual cells of your heart, the nerve cells and the muscle cells and so forth, you may not be able to predict from one moment to the next when each individual cell is going to fire, when the nerve cells are going to send a signal, when the muscle cells are going to contract. You may not be able to predict that completely accurately, but you can predict in a broad sense what my pulse is going to be, when my heart is going to be, when it's going to be resting, and so forth. And so that pattern, or that picture of a big scale stability, big scale order on top of lower scale or smaller scale unpredictability, not exactly randomness, or not what we think of as randomness as being completely unstructured, but some amount of unpredictability. That's kind of what chaos mathematics is all about, this sort of in-between structure, but it does kind of sit in between what we classically think of as order and as chaos. And I think that story you were talking about, to bring it back to the Iliad, that's kind of the tension, or that's kind of the two choices, the dichotomy that we feel like we face, right? Either there is some order and everything has a way that it has to unfold, and there's no flexibility. It's very rigid. It's very structured. This is the way that has to be. It's fate, whatever you want to call it. Or it just, anything goes, right? Those are your only two options. And I think what God's grace describes, and I think what the mathematics of chaos theory describes, is some other option where there is some overall pattern, there is some overall plan, however you want to phrase that, but there is also some flexibility, some resilience, some robustness to allow for individual freedom of choice, for individual preferences to be respected, and so on.
Yeah, can I give you another example that relates, to the history of theology also, but again draws on the Iliad. Agamemnon, who's the king of the Greeks, has been cursed because of his ancestor Tantalus had offended the gods. And the critical point in the story, Agamemnon gets into an argument with Achilles, who's his greatest warrior, and Achilles gets so angry he just walks off the battlefield, leaving the Greeks very vulnerable because they no longer have their lead fighter. So Agamemnon then addresses his troops a little bit later when Achilles finally does come back. And Agamemnon tries to tell the troops, I couldn't help it. I was fated to do this, to have this argument with Achilles. It's the god Ate, the goddess of blindness. It blinded my eyes, and it's not my fault. I did it, but I couldn't help it. And his men just mock him. They say, "Oh, get out of here! You knew what you were doing. Nobody forced you to offend Achilles. You chose to do that." Now, jumping ahead here, in John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, in his discussion on the sovereignty of God and the providence of God that oversees everything, he uses this example from the Iliad. And his point is, in effect, both realms are true. In other words, yes, there is a plan of God or plan of fate that is affecting what's happening here, but Agamemnon still chose to do what he did, and he was not in any direct way physically or mentally forced to do that. And so that's sort of Calvin's answer to the person who wants to say, well, if God has determined everything and it's all in his hands and predestination, why bother? It's just all sort of there. Is Calvin reading that right, would you say?
Well, I think in the way that I'm talking about these things, the way that I would describe it maybe a little bit differently is that both are true, but maybe operating at different levels of scale. And maybe that is what kind of Calvin is getting at, that Agamemnon is not, that individual choice is not being determined. The neurons in his brain aren't being manipulated by some outside force, or his limbs aren't being controlled by something other than his own consciousness or his own unconscious nervous system or what have you. All the things that we kind of ascribe to bodily autonomy or personal choice are valid there, but that there is some at a higher scale. There are certain sequences of events or certain outcomes that are going to happen because of some structure or some overarching guidance or plan or what have you, and that there's some freedom within that plan for how the outcome could come to be, but that there, at some big scale, there are certain things that are going to happen. The story that I think of a lot when I think of that is the story of Esther from the Bible, where Esther is considering the possibility of going to the king and explaining the situation, that she's a Jew and that what's going to happen to the Jewish people, and trying to intervene on their behalf to save them from the fate that has been put into law, right? It's not the fate of the god, a fate assigned by some gods or something like that. It's fate ascribed by the legal system of Persia, and she wants to save them from that, but at some personal risk to herself. And she's talking with Mordecai about that, and he describes to her a situation in which she has complete choice to act or not act. She can go and intervene, or she cannot. But on a bigger scale, Mordecai believes that God will rescue his people, the Jews, in some fashion. That deliverance will come one way or another. And it's basically what Esther's choice is: does she want to be part of that deliverance or not? That's what is in front of her. Not the choice isn't can this deliverance happen or not? Will this deliverance happen or not? That's not the choice that she has to make. The choice is what part does she want to play in it, if any. And so maybe the same thing, could be described of Agamemnon, right? That the same outcome for the Greeks and the Trojans and so forth was going to happen, and it was merely a question of what role Agamemnon wanted to play in that, rather than whether he could actually change the outcome or not.
Okay, that's I think that's fascinating. If I recall, Mordecai's statement is, if you do not do this, he says to Esther, God's rescue will come from another place.
Right.
You said it's going to. What about the statement when Jesus is talking about Judas and says, the Son of Man goes as it was determined, but woe to the one by whom he goes?
Yeah, so that's an interesting situation, right? Because there you're talking about a consequence that we would generally put maybe in a more negative light, whereas the deliverance of the Jews we might consider to be a more positive thing, and so it's a good thing that that's in God's plan. Of course, there are also positive ways of thinking about the death of Jesus within overall Christian theology, right? But it does say, "Woe to him who is involved," right? So there's this sense of this thing has to happen, and it's going to happen. At the same time, whoever chooses to be a part of it in this way has chosen to do something. Is it wrong? Is it hateful? Is it spiteful? I'm not sure even exactly the right word to use there. Because of that, because we know that it does fit into this plan, and we know that there are positive outcomes from it in the long run. But yeah, there is some sense of, well, if you don't do it, somebody else will. But also, you don't want to be that somebody. But if nobody wants to, if nobody chooses to be that somebody because nobody wants to do it, because woe to them, it won't happen. So there is still a genuine paradox there, or at least unclear situation there in terms of responsibility. What does it mean to be responsible if I can choose freely, but also somebody has to choose this thing for which there will be negative consequences.
It's sort of the flip side of Esther's question. It's going to happen anyway. Do you want to be part of it?
Exactly right. And so there it sounds like, well, yeah, I want to be part of it because it's a good thing, and I want to be part of a thing that I want to have happen come to pass, so that I can share in it, so that I can be pleased about it and so forth. But yeah, here's this flip side, this negative side of, well, something negative is going to happen. It's going to have negative consequences for whoever causes it to happen in the most proximal sense of causing it. But it's still going to happen. So somebody, it must come about somehow. Does that mean that there's a possibility that it could happen without any person being responsible, that some other impersonal set of events could have happened otherwise? Maybe. Is that the get out of jail free card kind of thing? I don't know. But but yeah, certainly you can see that they are very similar situations, just sort of reversed in terms of the consequences for who's participating.
Switching gears for a little bit. I've known people who, and you have too, I'm sure we all have, who say, well, how can we believe in a God who allows all this terrible suffering to take place in the world? And I think of what's going on right now in Ukraine, and how can God allow this? If there really is a God, why would he permit such terrible suffering? We see the refugees, and again, we all been inundated with this from the press and from the media. And how does it? How do you kind of? I mean, that's a question we all get faced with, Andy. And what do you suggest we might say to the the good intention but still very skeptical person who says, how can there be a God when these things happen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is one of the great questions, right? And so I'm not going to pretend that I have the complete answer or fully satisfactory answer, because it's a question we've been asking for as long as we've been keeping track of the questions we ask. But I think this kind of language can speak to part of it. I think the first thing that I would say is that, acknowledging that these evils, these negative situations, these negative outcomes are real and undesirable, right? It is not a good thing for individual people to be suffering under violence, under displacement, suffering ill health. All these things are going on, and I would not want to label those things as good, in their own, in and of themselves, right? And I want to stand with those, come alongside those people and acknowledge you are experiencing something that is genuine suffering, genuine ill, and it does not bring me any happiness or to see you in that situation. I think we can then also acknowledge that within Christian teaching and within the Christian tradition, we believe in a God who also acknowledges that suffering and chose to be a part of the suffering of humanity himself, and chose to come to this world incarnated as Jesus and go through the experience of suffering, both physical pain, emotional suffering, the loss of friends and family, all these things. Maybe not exactly the same circumstances that everybody's gone through, but it's certainly the God that we read about in the Bible is not a God who is unfamiliar with what we are experiencing as humans. And then I would say, going back to what we were just talking about, I think that part of why we see things happen in the world is that on the level of individual choices, God does not always get the outcome that he intends or wants. And so these outcomes are the result of individual choices by people that they are making freely, and may not always be in accordance with what God would have wanted for that specific situation. That doesn't mean that God's overall plan is being thwarted, but that God has chosen to allow for freedom at the level of these individual choices, and that means that sometimes people choose the result. People make a choice that results in more suffering than God might have preferred. And it does feel weird sometimes talking about, well, God doesn't get things how he wants them. That does seem maybe at odds with a God who is sovereign. But I think that's part of what we see in the Bible. If nothing else, we look at the very first chapters of Genesis. It seems hard to believe that, or if we take it at face value, what God has said about what he wants, and then the choices that Adam and Eve make, they are contrary to what God wanted for them or what God asked of them. And the same thing happens, in many other instances. And so it seems like there is some reality to the idea that people can choose contrary to what God would have wanted for that individual situation. At the same time, at the bigger scale, it is not possible to deviate from God's ultimate plans, ultimate desires for his creation.
Yes, it's sort of the idea of God rules and overrules. For example, when you're talking about the book of Genesis from the last chapter, where Joseph is speaking to his brothers who tried to kill him and sold him into slavery and so forth. And he has this famous line that, again, John Calvin picks up a lot. And he says, you meant it unto me for evil, but God meant it unto me for good. And Calvin says there, and he's got quite a commentary on Genesis, Calvin says there, God is not saying that that God is not being the author of evil there. God did not make the brothers do this, but God did plan to redeem Israel from, just wanted to safeguard Joseph. But again, it could have happened in different ways, as we said. But it's the idea there that that even the evil intention and indeed actions of the brothers is reframed by God for a positive purpose. And specifically, alleviating the food shortage and the famine, and preserving the family of Jacob, and keeping the covenant going. All those sort of things are contingent on Joseph's role here, but God doesn't embrace the evil, but God acts in spite of the evil. Is that maybe the right way to say it, you think?
That feels like it's in the right direction. Yeah, because I think it is important to be able to differentiate between it was necessary for this evil thing to have happened in order for God's plan to be realized, and it is possible for God to realize his plan despite the fact that this evil thing has happened. Okay. And I think what we're trying to say the latter is true, and it sounds like that John Calvin would agree with that. But it is easy if you're not careful with the language about how we talk about these things to wind up sounding like the first option, that the only way that God could have brought about something good is for something bad to have happened to you, and so sorry that you had to deal with that, but it was worth it in the long run. And because people may not feel that way, right? Because they've gone through this experience, it may not be worth it to them. It may not feel like it was worth the end result to them to have gone through that experience. Or perhaps the good thing that comes out of it may not be a benefit that's realized to them, it's realized to somebody else, and so they may not see that as worthwhile. But I do think there is value in trying to say, look, these evil things have happened, these bad things have happened, suffering has been experienced. Now, what can we make of it? Here's where we are now. What can we make of it that pushes us in the direction of something positive, something good, pushes in the direction of human flourishing, as opposed to more human suffering, even though we would have much preferred it that we were never at this place at the first point.
Yeah, well, Andy, it's not like we're having trouble finding something to talk about here. Right? Listen, our time is almost up. I just want to throw out another question. I knowing your father from church and stuff, I gather you have some interest in science fiction. How does that play out for you?
Yeah, so we've already touched on the mythology, the stories of the Iliad and Agamemnon and so forth. We've talked about stories from the Bible. I think science fiction stories are another way that we can get into these topics that puts them on a more human scale. One of the challenges of dealing with scientific issues, and especially more recent sciences, as we've gotten further and further, thanks to improvements in technology, we've gotten further and further away from the scale of human experience. We're looking at the microscopic and beyond in terms of small scales, right? The atomic, the subatomic. We're looking at out into the universe and the vastness of the cosmos, out beyond our galaxy, talking about superclusters of galaxies, right? All these things are way beyond human scale, and so it's very easy to feel like you're just talking about things that are abstract and unrelatable. And so anytime that we can ground these conversations in stories that are about the human scale, I think that's helpful just in terms of being able to start the conversation or finding a point that's a little bit easier to grasp onto. And which stories in particular doesn't really matter. We have so many of them, and they because of the common features of human experience, they often touch on very similar themes, right? So these questions of who's responsible for what, and causality and so forth, right? Those come up in ancient Greek stories. Those come up in things like Jurassic Park, right? Who's responsible for the dinosaurs running amok, and could anybody have done anything to have stopped it? And so these are age-old questions. These are age-old themes in stories, but there's always something new, and so just finding the story that people are familiar with that can make that connection with them, I think, is worthwhile. And the stories that I know best are the science fiction stories and comic book stories from books and movies that are popular at the moment, and so that's where I try to start those conversations from. But it can work from lots of different kinds of stories, and it's just a matter of knowing your audience or being able to find some common point to start that conversation.
Yeah, I assume C.S. Lewis's novel Pearlandra, which raises the question of what about a planet where there was no fall?
Right.
Evil could have been averted.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting series of books, and I like the way that it starts out with those sort of more very hypothetical questions, and by the end of the trilogy, it's dealing with a much more practical question of, well, what about the people who actually existed or who actually exist in our world, but who are outside of the sphere of communication of the gospel, right? That the news hasn't reached them yet, or didn't get a chance to reach them, or the arrival, the incarnation of Jesus happened after they were alive. Those are all actually very real questions that we come across, and I thought it was an interesting way how C.S. Lewis kind of started with those questions of, well, in the science fiction realm, we can even get further afield and get to more extremes of that kind of question by thinking about life on other planets, and then maybe that can help us to kind of reframe the actual questions that we are thinking about a little bit more practically, and see if it changes the conversation, gives us a new way of thinking about it, a new perspective.
Okay. Well, Andy, our time is up. I really appreciate your taking the opportunity to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I would just recommend Andy's book, which you can find online, Faith Across the Multiverse, where he deals with many of these issues in more obviously in more detail than we can here in a half an hour podcast. But Andy, I want to thank you so much for being with us. You've been both illuminating and enlightening.
Well, great. Thanks. And thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Okay, terrific.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror,
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that one again. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.